I'm going to start with just a slide which probably reinforces what John's just said about some of the big headlines about the impact of the cyber threat on the UK as a whole. So the value, the length of time that malware can sit undetected, the volume in terms of numbers. So this bottom one here, the Office of Personnel Management in the US, obviously not a UK, but 21.5 million records sort of compromised in a single attack or series of attacks. And then the fact that the UK, back in 2010, identified cyber as one of the 4 Tier 1 threats or Tier 1 risks facing the UK. Just gives you a sense of how important this is seen and perceived within government. But why the particular focus on the supply chain? Well, for the simple fact that, to paraphrase John Donne, no organisation is an island. We all have suppliers who have, well, not all, the majority of us have suppliers, certainly in the MOD we have suppliers who have physical connections to our networks. For those of you who know about the Target supermarket breach in the US, where 40 million payment card details were compromised, widely accepted that the route that the attackers took to achieve that compromise was through initially compromising the systems of a small heating, ventilation and air conditioning company who provided services to Target. So they went for the weak link, a small company who maybe didn't think that they would be in the sights of a serious criminal organisation. Through that, compromised credentials, gained access to the Target network and were able to install their malware and achieve their outcomes. But in addition to those sorts of connections, there are also a number of suppliers who will either handle or even generate information that you care about, that we care about. And that our perception in defence is we need to be confident that those suppliers are adequately protecting that information to the same standard that we would if we were holding it on our network. In the MOD, in terms of the numbers, well, the truth is we don't know how many suppliers we've got. We reckon approximate 6,000 or what we would call Tier 1 suppliers. That's suppliers with whom we contract directly. But clearly below that, there are a countless additional number sitting in their supply chains and who may also be having information or who also may have a connection which leads to a connection and so on. And then bringing that sort of closer to home, we have the results of the 2015 Information Breaches Survey, which showed that just under 3/4 of smaller organisations and 9 in 10 large organisations reported that they had suffered some form of security breach in the previous 12 months. The cost of those breaches, even for an SME, between £75,000 to £311,000. And yet, despite the fact that just under a third of those same respondents to that survey had not carried out any form of security risk assessment. And yet within that number must have been some of those who had suffered a breach and had suffered a financial consequence. So we're talking about a supply chain who do not in all levels understand or recognise the threat they are facing and are certainly not taking the necessary measures to address them. And why might that be? Well, because some of the reasons might be, I haven't been attacked. Well, there's a statement which says you've got 2 sorts of companies, those who have been attacked and those who are yet to discover that they've been attacked. Everyone is a target. I'm too small to be a target. Well, that just simply isn't true. Even if it's an e-criminal targeting a small company, even I think I read about a couple of months ago about hairdressers in Glasgow who had been targeted for a ransomware attack. Anyone can be a target. They may not be after information, but they will be a target of some form of cyber adversary. You can't afford to do anything about it. Well, the obvious riposte to that is you can't afford not to do something about this. If the long-term financial viability of your business is dependent upon being cyber secure, then a relatively small investment now will reap long-term benefits. And then the argument that maybe it's the responsibility of someone else, maybe it's the CIO, or it's the prime contractor, is a term we use in MOD, or it's the ultimate customer, in our case the MOD. And that may well be true. But if you as a supplier want to continue working for that prime supplier or that ultimate customer, then you need to demonstrate that you are adequately protecting yourself and their information from this threat. So kind of trying to bring that all together in a nutshell on a single slide. So why fundamentally does this matter to defence? Because from the private sector side, any loss of intellectual property, any erosion of your competitive position, any negative reputation, all of those things can impact on the bottom line, revenue, profit and share price. But from the public sector perspective, we care about those same things. The prosperity agenda is a key driver for UK government. And the drive for the UK to be seen as a good and safe place to do e-business. How can we push that message if there is a perception that the supply chain is not secure? From a defence perspective, we have the added component of any potential loss of military capability and the consequences of that. So not just about numbers on a balance sheet, but if there is a piece of kit currently being developed, the details of how it operates are compromised and we don't understand that. We go to use it at an operational theatre for the first time in anger in, say, 3 years' time, and it's only at that point that we discover our adversary is able to mitigate and negate its effects. We lose operational advantage. That could have impact on the life and limbs of soldiers, sailors, and men and women. So bringing this all together was a commitment set out by the then Secretary of State, Philip Hammond, back in 2012, that team defence, which is the collective term we use for MOD, the military and the defence supply chain working together, needed to grip this issue, do something about it, and one of the ways we would do something about it would be contractually to include elements in contracts setting out the requirements that suppliers must adhere to. So the Defence Cyber Protection Partnership was born, 13 defence primes, 2 trade associations, ADS and Tech UK, representing the interests of small to medium enterprises, and alongside us and the MOD, other bits of government playing their parts. 3 overarching sort of areas of focus, one around improving information sharing, so better understanding and sharing of threat and vulnerability information, implementing, designing proportionate measurements and standards, controls that can go into contracts, and then raising the level of supply chain awareness, tackling that issue that a third of suppliers are doing, carrying out no form of security assessment, despite the fact that some of them are suffering breaches and financial consequences. So in terms of the outputs and the work we've done, so information sharing has been very much about supporting the work of the CISP, Cybersecurity Information Sharing Partnership, which is an initiative of the Search UK, shortly to become part of the new National Cybersecurity Centre, provides a platform which allows members, who can either be individuals or organisations, to receive regular updates on the threats and vulnerabilities that are being seen out on networks, either gathered together by a central fusion team and pushed out, or shared by other members. And so our role has been about encouraging defence suppliers to become part of that. But I would extend that to anyone in this room who's not already a member to explore that further. Supply chain awareness, it's just been about grabbing opportunities, presenting at conferences, writing articles in relevant publications, putting content on the government website, gov.uk, and even establishing a small presence on social media. So there is a DCPP LinkedIn group, if anyone wants to become a member of that. But the main focus has been on the measurements and standards work and the production of what we have called the cybersecurity model as our key output. Now, this is our approach to addressing, to identifying the risk, setting the controls, and then measuring compliance. So it begins with a risk assessment. So this is designed to be carried out by the customer. So in all cases, that will be the MOD, but it's not necessarily designed to be done by an information security expert. It's designed to be done by someone who understands the nature of the contract, the thing they are trying to procure, whether it's a product or a service. And they're faced with a series of 12 questions, and based on the answers they give to those questions, that sets one of 5 levels of risk for the contract. Now, that can be not applicable, because we recognise that there are some contracts which genuinely carry no level of cyber risk. The provision of routine nuts and bolts that will go into screwing together a bit of a new submarine, but which are just generic off the shelf. So there's no information there that we in defence need to protect. We might say to the supplier, best practice would suggest do something, but we're not going to contractually oblige you. There's then 4 levels of what we call sort of tangible cyber risk, which goes very low, low, moderate and high. For each of those 4 levels, there is then a commensurate set of controls in the form of what we call a cyber profile. So for each profile, for each level of risk, there is a profile which says these are the controls that you need to have in place. And those build as you go up through the levels of risk. So at the very low level, the only thing we ask is compliance or achievement of the Cyber Essentials Scheme certification. So those 5 technical controls set out in that. And then as you go up through the levels of risk, we still want to see you having Cyber Essentials, but we're going to say here are some additional controls that you need on top. And clearly at the high level of risk, you have the most sort of full set of controls required. There is then a supplier assurance questionnaire. Now, this is how the suppliers demonstrate their level of compliance. And again, it's based on self-assessment, but with the right to audit, and it's just a series of questions relating to those controls. And it's effectively, if the control says, do you patch, you must patch your systems, then the question will be, how frequently do you patch your systems? And it's just a way of testing that compliance. So again, as the level of risk increases, the number of questions in that supplier assurance questionnaire also increases. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you will notice that at the bottom of that right-hand box is an arrow that takes you back up to the start. Now, that's because this process does not only exist at the MOD to Tier 1 level. It is designed to flow down through that supply chain where it exists. And that's because that risk can exist anywhere in that supply chain, and we need that confidence all the way down that it's being appropriately managed. So where a prime contractor is awarded a contract by the MOD, where they then choose to subcontract elements of that, they will be expected to carry out their own risk assessment using the same question set on each of those bits that they're going to subcontract. And that's to ensure that they set a proportionate level of risk for those subcontracts. Because it does not follow that if MOD assesses a top-level contract as being high risk, that everything within that supply chain is also high risk. Some of it will be, much of it won't be. And it would be disproportionate to expect a small to medium enterprise to have to demonstrate compliance against that full set of controls if the bit they're doing is much lower risk. But in turn, they will be expected to demonstrate that they are compliant, again, using the same tool. And the idea is it flows down all the way through the supply chain until you hit a not applicable level of risk, i.e. there is no more risk. This slide just looks to explain a little bit more detail about how the controls work. So as you go up through the levels of risk, clearly we may add on additional controls. Hopefully you can see just about on the bottom part of the slide, it talks about the types of controls. So we begin only with technical controls. As we go up through the levels of risk, we add on additional technical controls, but we also add in controls around governance, around culture, around personnel, so that at the highest level you end up with a much more holistic sense that this organisation really understands cyber risk and is taking all the necessary measures to protect itself from the threat that it poses. Now, an obvious question is, well, what if a supplier can't comply? Does that mean they just can't compete for that contract? They can't be considered? And the fact is not necessarily. In some cases, the default is we want full compliance, but we recognise that's not always going to be possible, particularly maybe in the initial stages of rollout when this is new and people are having to get up to grips with what it requires. So what we have done is designed what we call a risk acceptance process, and that allows a supplier who goes through this process, comes out having completed their questionnaire showing that they're not fully compliant, to allows them to set out either their plan for achieving compliance. It may just be they need 6 months, or it may be that they will never be fully compliant, but this is how they can set out how they're going to mitigate the risk through alternate means. And where we are content that that approach is appropriate and that the risk carried is something we're prepared to accept, then they can be treated on a par with the suppliers who are fully compliant. In terms of our plan for implementation, since the beginning of this year, we have been implementing the requirement for Cyber Essentials on any new contract that involves what we call mod identifiable information. So that's basically the threshold from not applicable to very low. Is there some information either created, generated, or transferred as part of this contract which we want to see protected? From the beginning of August, we began what we called a controlled launch of the full model. So at this stage, what we're doing is we're just identifying specific contracts, getting them to complete a risk assessment, and in turn, in time, expecting their suppliers to complete the supplier assurance questionnaire. At a date to be confirmed, but no later than next April, we will be rolling out this full model on all new requirements that come through the MOD. And then at some point in the future, we will address the issue of legacy contracts, because clearly there are contracts that maybe still have a number of years to run, carrying some risk, and whilst we can't necessarily implement this approach now on them, we can't ignore it because it's important that we address those risks there as well. Looking ahead, the final sort of area of focus is the issue of what we call sort of alignment with other approaches. So we're mindful that defence suppliers may well operate across multiple sectors and multiple geographical territories, and over time it is likely that they will be asked to complete similar assurance activities in those other countries or in those other sectors. And because one of our commitments is to minimising the burden on suppliers, what we don't want to do is for them to have to duplicate effort answering similar but different approaches. So what we have said is that where we become aware of the existence of those other approaches, we will work with either those other sectors or those other governments to agree a principle of mutual recognition, so that if you're a UK or a supplier to the UK MOD and you've demonstrated compliance with the full set of the high-risk controls, that if you go to do a piece of work for the Australian Department of Defence, they would recognise that as providing equivalent assurance to their approach, and vice versa. So a principle of what we're calling mutual recognition. That's not going to happen in the short term, but it is an intent and a commitment to get there in due course. Final slide just kind of few pointers to where you can find out more information about any of these things. So the DCPP, as I said, content on the gov.uk website, /mod/DCPP. Similar place to go to find out about the Cyber Essentials scheme. CISP, which is the information sharing platform. If you're not already members, I would absolutely commend that to you. You do need to be sponsored by either an existing member, a government department, or a trade association. But hopefully that you will know someone who falls into one of those three categories. And then the HMG 10 Steps to Cybersecurity, which is a CESG, which is the GCHQ Information Assurance Wing, their approach to controls which broadly align with our high-risk approach. I've got a slide that says questions. I don't think I've probably got very much time for any. If that is the case, then there's my email address, so you're more than welcome to take that and contact me separately, or if you do things on Twitter, you can reach me on Twitter.
Daniel, thank you very much indeed.